The writer's strike has been going on for damn near 4 months now. The SAG AFTRA strike is also well into a couple of months, and things are starting to take a turn for the worse, especially for the Hollywood elites. Me personally, I'm not seeing a whole lot of differences, and I imagine most people out there aren't seeing that. But I think with what we're seeing, some of the fallout from the strikes that's going on right now, we might see some changes coming in the very near future. Sources tell The Hollywood Reporter Warner Brothers Discovery has suspended a number of overall deals for its top creatives, including J.J. Abrams' Bad Robot, Greg Berlanti, Chuck Lorre, Bill Lawrence, John Well, and Mindy Kaling. Sources say Lorre's multi-year pact with his decade-long studio was quietly suspended in May. A week into the strikes, all 6 prolific producers are behind multiple shows and all have development projects at the studio that they have been working on. It's important to note that the deals have been suspended and not outright canceled or dropped, as once the labor actions conclude, Warner's will need its top producers to ramp up writing and producing immediately as the content pipeline continues to thin. Damn, those are some really big names. We're talking J.J. Abrams, Chuck Lorre, Greg Berlanti, and you also got Mindy Kaling in there. Maybe not such a big name, but when you think about it, that's really starting to hit some of these really big production companies, and it sounds like Chuck Lorre probably hasn't been getting paid to produce content for well over 3 months at this point. It's actually pretty crazy. Obviously, this is a comic book and pop culture channel with a heavy emphasis on comic book content, and Greg Berlanti is the one that obviously stands out for me. I absolutely love Superman and Lois. This is the best live action version of Superman that we've had in decades, in my opinion. It's the definitive version of Superman, probably for a couple of generations of people, that didn't get introduced to the character through Christopher Reeves and some of the other great Superman content that we've had in the past. And losing that show really does suck. We know that it was picked up for an extra season. I don't believe it's going to be on CW. I think it's moving over to Max. And that's going to be a huge loss for DC Comics fans because, we're not going to get a movie for at least 2 years after Aquaman comes out. We're going to have a big break while James Gunn gets ready for the DCU. And the best thing out there really that's DC related, at least in my opinion, it's not even close, is Superman and Lois. Obviously, that's going to be a really big loss for DC fans that enjoy seeing their heroes, not just in comic books, but on the small screen, big screen, and stuff like that, because that was the best thing out there. The J.J. Abrams thing, obviously, Bad Robot was an enormous deal. When they signed their exclusive with Warner Brothers Discovery, all of a sudden, J.J. Abrams had, 15 billion projects in the pipeline, and notably, 2 of them were comic book related. Justice League Dark was like the really, really big one, I think, for a lot of DC Comics fans. That thing's been in limbo for quite some time. I actually think it might have just got outright canceled. He also had another Superman movie that he was going to produce that Ta-Nehisi Coates was actually going to write. I guess it was going to be like the Black Superman movie. That one's a little bit different of a situation. I think it got canceled. I don't think they're moving forward on it, but they don't want the negative press that comes along with announcing that you've canceled the Ta-Nehisi Coates, J.J. Abrams Black Superman movie, which never really made all that much sense in the first place. There's so many different Black Kryptonians in the DC Comics universe. Like, why would you make Kent Black at this point? Like, everyone knows who that character is. You still have President Superman and several other Black Kryptonian characters out there to lead on, and I don't know why they didn't run with that one. With the big comic book projects associated with J.J. Abrams, Chuck Lorre, obviously, he's had so many ultra successful sitcom shows out there. I guess the really big one would be The Big Bang Theory. Before that, 2.5 Men. Yeah, I believe it was 2.5 Men. I think he's the guy that fired Charlie Sheen for going crazy or whatever. And then, obviously Mindy Kaling, a little bit notorious at this point. I thought she was really funny in The Office as a supporting character. Then she had the Mindy Kaling show. I tried to watch that one. It turns out she wasn't as funny in that one. Maybe it was the writing or something. Maybe because she was the writer, it wasn't funny. Although I think she was one of the writers on The Office. I don't get it. And then obviously she had the notorious, I guess, Scooby-Doo spin-off Thelma show that everyone was making fun of during its entire run. I imagine that was never going to come back. But, those are some really big names, and those are some elites in Hollywood, especially when you're talking about a J.J. Abrams, a Chuck Lorre, maybe not so much a Greg Berlanti or Mindy Kaling, but these strikes are definitely starting to affect some really important people. In Hollywood that have a lot of sway. And I imagine with these things kind of happening and people that were counting on projects or moving forward with the projects no longer getting to do so and the money drying up, eventually everyone's going to have to come to the table because everybody's going to start losing money at this point. We did have the story out there that so far Warner Brothers Discovery had saved like $100 or $200 million because of these strikes, but in the long term, they're going to lose a lot more money. And this is eventually going to start affecting Hollywood in other ways, more important ways down the road, if they actually don't come to the negotiating table and come to some sort of agreement. In fact, Warner Brothers Discovery CEO David Zaslav actually had an investor call this week and was talking about some of the very negative effects on his company as far as financial. Warner Brothers Discovery expects the ongoing Hollywood strikes to have a $300 to $500 million negative impact on the company's 2023 earnings. In an SEC filing Tuesday, the David Zaslav-led media giant stated it was expecting lower adjusted earnings for the full year between $10.5 to $11 $7 billion based on the projection that the continuing WGA and SAG AFTRA work stoppages will mean a hit of $300 to $500 million for the company. And I imagine in different times, $300 to $500 million negative impact on a company like Warner Brothers or Disney or some of these other bigger companies wouldn't be that bad. But a lot of them, there's been so much consolidation. There's been so much acquisition over the last few years that almost all these companies are just saddled with these enormous piles of debt on top of them, where you think $300 to $500 million negative impact on the company is really going to have some real impacts on them. And I will give this one to David Zaslav from Warner Brothers Discovery. I know a lot of people took umbrage with him. They weren't very happy with what happened with Batgirl and that cancellation. But as far as his reaction to these ongoing strikes and going out there and talking, I think he's been a pretty good public figure. He seems to have a good business sense. He's not going out there and kind of making an ass of himself, kind of like Bob Iger is. He appears, at least from the interviews and what I've seen about him, much more willing to sit down at the table and strike out a deal and acknowledging that, yes, we can probably pay these people more, but there are bigger things going on right here. So hopefully people finally sit down. They realize everyone's losing right now, except for really the consumer, because I've got so much stuff that I can watch anyway. It doesn't really matter. But all the people being hurt by this are really the production companies, the producers, the directors, obviously the writers, the actors. And then you have like the second and third order effects, like people that worked on the set, painters, prop designers, and all these people are really all the ones losing. And no one's ever going to start winning again until they come to the table. Like there are some things that I think are very difficult to negotiate at the table. Like how do you negotiate like residual payments in perpetuity for streaming shows when these streaming platforms, at least right now, are all losing money? There's no way to actually decide or determine what was the positive financial impact that your show had and will continue to have by still being on the streaming platform. There's a lot of weird things to negotiate out there because we are going to a streaming version, at least of television. And it feels like kind of movies are definitely going that way too. We don't really have that many mid-budget movies. Those have kind of all moved over to Netflix, or they're on Apple TV, or they're on Prime Video. And now you've got, HBO and Disney making their own kind of mid-budget movies for their platforms and stuff. So we've already lost that really in the movie theater experience. You can only really watch blockbusters for the most part. Although there are a few mid-budget movies that come out every now and again, but these are very difficult things to really iron out and hash out because nobody wants to not get their residuals or their payments for the work that they did 2 years ago. Well, maybe in 5 years, if we're finally profitable, we'll pay you for this show that was a success, but we're still losing money. That's kind of one of the real net negatives from moving from over-the-air, like legacy television, cable, because you had the ad rates. And if your show was popular, you got higher ad rates and everyone made more money. And it's really hard to determine that. And that's why you're getting so many like ad-supported tiers on all these streaming platforms that for the most part, I don't think a whole lot of customers are interested in. Like the reason that you want streaming is because you don't want ads, right? Wasn't that the whole point? But we're kind of moving to this weird little like mini versions of cable that are branded where you're going to have to get ads in them just to not be overwhelmed by the amount you're paying for streaming. Speaking of streaming, David Zaslav also had some interesting things to say about the future of streaming and bundling different packages and networks together moving into the future. The bundles are coming according to Warner Brothers Discovery CEO David Zaslav. Speaking at a Goldman Sachs conference Wednesday, the executive said that his company has had discussions with other companies in the content space about developing new bundles to create a better consumer experience. Those conversations have picked up in the last few months, Zaslav said. He gave the example of Max's recent experiment to offer content from the AMC networks for a limited window. And I truly believe we're going to see a whole lot more of this. Do you guys remember, like, I guess it was the mid-90s, the early 2000s, well, all of a sudden there were like 3 or 4 different satellite radio networks that were out there. And really you could only have one satellite network in your car. And like they were splitting up the market. It turned out none of it was profitable, even though they gave, I think it was Howard Stern, like some type of record $1 billion deal or something insane. But eventually you had to get consolidation. Like these different companies just had to become one single company because there weren't enough customers out there to support 3 or 4 different networks of satellite radio at the time. And I think we're going to see the same thing happen with all this streaming stuff. There doesn't need to be a Peacock network, a Paramount network, a Disney network, an Apple network, a Prime network, an HBO network, and Netflix all competing in the exact same space because it just really ruins consumer options. I'd rather watch maybe 3 or 4 of those and skip the others, but it gets so expensive if you order them all individually. And I don't think there's enough space within the market itself to support that many networks. Like there's no reason Peacock and Paramount should even exist right now. They don't have enough going for them individually to really compete. But Peacock and Paramount Paramount may be bundled with HBO Max, can compete with Netflix, or it can compete with a Prime Video or a Disney Plus, but on their own, there just isn't enough there to really make the price point worth it in the long run. And I think we're going to see a lot of consolidation. And I imagine all these losses that are piling up during these strikes are actually going to move that forward. It's going to end up happening faster than it would have if these strikes never happened and all of a sudden these companies started losing even more money while they have these enormous amounts of debt sitting over them. I think it's a really interesting time. I imagine this strike, probably the players on both sides of this are eventually going to have to get together really soon, because we're starting to see some real effects from these strikes where we're having production companies that are very successful and very influential shut down because their writers can't really work anymore. You know, it's been 4 months at this point. They made their point. They can't even promote movies at this point. You're having to delay movies and stuff because the actors can't go out there and promote it. And I think it's in everyone's best interest, really besides the customer, to sit down at the table, listen to each other, and really strike a deal that makes sense on both sides, because everyone involved at this point is probably losing a whole lot of money. Me personally, I could take it or leave it. You know, let the strikes go on in perpetuity. I know it's affecting a whole lot of people, but there's so much content out there that's ready-made and ready to binge that I haven't seen before anyway, that I think this is affecting people in a much different way than it did even, 10 years ago when it happened. And I think they've overestimated just how much the public are going to be impacted by this. I kind of talked about it in this video right here, had some fun with it, and really spelled out my thoughts on the situation. There's also a link in the video description.